everybody, what's up and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Liz. And today we're going to be continuing on our Doe cases that have been identified in 2022. So in my previous video, I covered 5. We're going to be covering another 5. So this will bring us to 10 of the Doe cases that have been identified in 2022. So number 1 on this video is Tracy Sue Walker. Now, she went by 3 different names. When she was an unidentified, it was the Campbell County Jane Doe, the Elk Valley Jane Doe, and Baby Girl, as she was known as. Now, she was discovered in April of 1985 when her skeletal remains were found in the Big Wheel Gap off of Elk Valley in Campbell County, hence why Elk Valley in Campbell County. Now, the remains they were able to determine belonged to a female between the ages of 10 to 15, so she was very young, but they couldn't figure out her identity. In 2013, this case was revisited by a Tennessee Bureau of Investigations officer, so he could reevaluate the case and hopefully catch a break in this case. But identity, we still wouldn't find out. He wouldn't get, or they wouldn't get a break in this case for 9 years. Now, in 2022, the TBI started working with the University of Tennessee's anthropology department, and they sent a sample of DNA from the Campbell County Jane Doe to Othram. Othram is a company I have talked about in previous videos, and they work with genetic genealogy. Now, with the help of Othram, they were able to use advanced genome filtering, and with this, they were then one step further to identifying who this unknown child was. In June of 2022, Othram then was able to provide a possible relative for the Campbell County Jane Doe. And in fact, they put 2 and 2 together that this Jane Doe was in fact that same family member from that family that had been missing since 1978. They then were able to obtain the familial DNA and they cross-referenced them together and they got a match. The Campbell County Jane Doe was identified as Tracy Sue Walker, who went missing from Lafayette, Indiana in 1978 when she was just 11 years old. Her death is linked to the Redhead murders, of which I have already made a video about her, and I have talked about the Redhead murders previously. You guys loved that, and I will put it in a card above for you guys to click on. That way you can enjoy her video. Her murder does remain unsolved, but like I said, it is linked to the Redhead murders. Number 2 for today's video is Susan Poole. Now, the partial skeletal remains of a female were discovered by a man and his 2 teenage sons on June 16th of 1974 at North Palm Beach in Florida. The parts of the skeleton itself were kind of scattered around the area, which led investigators to think that there was prominent animal activity around her remains. With the animal activity, they were unable to tell exactly how, in fact, she did die, but they were able to find some holes that were similar shaped to gunshot wounds or gunshot holes in the sweater they believe she was wearing at the time of her death. They also believed that she was bound to one of the trees in the area of where these remains were found because there were signs of ligature marks or binding. So the detectives had very little evidence to work with, but they did record her dental charts along with an estimated height and weight. And with the smallest amount of tissue that remained on the skeleton, they used it for a blood test. With DNA, they later then were able to obtain from a bone on her skeleton. They were able to sequence her genome, but they didn't have any matches in CODIS until they used the route of genetic genealogy in the fall of 2021. Now, initially, it was believed that this Jane Doe was Bonnie Robinson, who was missing from Detroit, Michigan. But any involvement with that kind of fell through because they figured that whole case out, or some of that case out. I also am thinking of covering her in another video, so stay tuned for future videos. There was also the possibility that Gerard Schaefer was involved in killing this woman, but the thing about him is that he liked to kill in pairs, and this Jane Doe was found by herself. So they weren't entirely sure that he was responsible for this murder. The only similarity for him is that he actually was a police officer in the same city that this Jane Doe disappeared from. And she was consistent with his choice of victims. She fit his MO. Now, the skeletonized female that was found would be identified as 15-year-old Susan Poole, who went missing on December 24th of 1972 in Wilton Manors, Florida. She would remain unidentified for 47 years until she was indeed identified on June 2nd, 2022. Her death is listed as presumed homicide, but it is still an unsolved murder at this point, and investigation is still active. Number 3 on today's video is Peggy Ann Dodd. I know I'm adding a lot of different, lesser-known identifieds in this list because every single John and Jane Doe is important for people to know who they were. So, Peggy Ann Dodd was last seen on June 6th of 1984 in Houston, Texas. At the time, she was separated from her husband, and she was known to often leave town for months at a time, but she was known to always return for her birthday and to spend Christmas with her family. When she was out and about, it was known for her to try and hitchhike across the country. When she didn't return, her family got very concerned. And what her family didn't know is that Peggy's remains were found under a tree in a field on December 22nd of 1984. So just 6 months after she went missing, her body was discovered. And that was on the north side of Highway 59 in Fort Bend, which is less than 18 miles from where her sister Blake Kennedy lived in Brazoria County. This skeleton that was found on that tragic day, police list the cause of death as undetermined because they could not determine her actual cause of death. For 38 years, her family had no idea what happened to her. But in June of 2022, using the rootless hair strands that were found on the skeleton, they were then able to identify this as Peggy Ann Dodd, who was 29 at the time of her death. And she would remain unidentified for 38 years. And her case is still unsolved. Number 4 for today's video is Carl Isaacs Jr. The nearly complete skeleton of a man was found at approximately 9 a.m. from a hunting party on private property that was alongside a creek. Now, this was a remote and heavily wooded 100-acre area that was owned by those hunters on Waite Road in Beloit, Wisconsin. The skeleton was almost complete and found lying on its belly with its hands over its head. So kind of either he fell that way or he was executed and fell. The head and the back were partially covered by a denim jacket. There was clothes and a shoe found on a steep embankment about 10 feet from the creek and about 4 feet from barbed wire on the property. Those were decided to ultimately be his, the clothes that were found were his. Now, this discovery was made in late 1995. They estimated that he possibly died in the fall or winter of 1994, which was about a year prior to the discovery of the skeleton, which kind of would make sense because of decomposition. That and it's in Wisconsin, so the weather's kind of like here in New England, but a little more frigid. Although it was later compared that it's entirely possible that he actually died in the summer of 1995 or about 5 months before he was found, which also can happen because it is very hot in the summer or can be hot in the summer of Wisconsin. And when it's warm, decomposition speeds up. So his insect activity would happen and then animals. I'm not going to go any further because I don't want to make you guys squeamish. I know a little bit too much about this stuff. Anywho, so the cause of death is listed as unknown due to no sources of trauma found on the skeleton. Homicide is likely to have caused his death. It is also likely that he could have died due to hypothermia. And if he was hypothermic, some people, when they get to that state, they oftentimes can drop due to not being able to sustain the warmth of their body. So he could have been disoriented, fell, and then ultimately just died. That also is another possibility. It's also another possibility that he was highly intoxicated to the point of disorientation, and then he just kind of fell. They did analysis of his hair, and there was no long-term drug use. They Couldn't determine if he had short-term use because oftentimes when you die, they really can only detect a long-term use. It all just depends on like the age of the body, what is left, and things like that. For some strange reason, his skull was cremated. I have no idea why. And the rest of his skeleton was buried in the Johnstown Center Cemetery in Wisconsin. Now, the characteristics that were given out about this John Doe is that he was about 5'4" to 5'6" in height, approximately 140 pounds, likely that he was between 17 and 20 of age. His teeth were straight, he received good dental care throughout his life, and he still had all 4 of his wisdom teeth. Now, the clothes that were found were a Venom t-shirt. Venom is a British metal band. Look them up, they're great. I wanted to preface that so people aren't like, oh my god, it's Venom from Spider-Man. No, it's a heavy metal band. He also wore gray camouflage fatigues that were in a small medium size, a flannel red and green lined jacket with a plaid design, medium sized boxers with a Bart Simpson insignia on it, and out of the shoes that were found, there was only one, and it was a 9.5 size black Nike Air, which is like, it's the Nike Airbound basketball shoe that came out in 1993. They were severely specific about this shoe in particular. Now, with the help of genetic genealogy in the DNA Doe project, in 2018, they attempted to use an autosomal DNA and uploaded the sequence to GEDmatch. GEDmatch is another genetics site. If you're not familiar with it, just kind of like browse at it. If you're not really into the DNA thing, I mean, I highly suggest everybody look into it because it's really cool. But in February of 2019, they believe they found a tentative match for this John Doe, but the identity was never revealed. His identity would be revealed on June 14th of 2022, when they revealed that this John Doe, in fact, was Carl Isaacs Jr. Carl Isaacs Jr. was from Delavan, and he was never reported missing, and he also had a bench warrant out for a probation violation. That was renewed every single year up until April 2018, even though he was technically missing, but nobody reported him missing. Carl Isaacs Jr.'s murder is still unsolved. Our last unidentified for this video is Gerron Gipson. The decomposing remains of an unidentified young man were found in Clarksburg, California on March 4th, 1999. This young man had, in fact, he was murdered. The state of decomposition is what caused the hindrance in his initial identification. His cause of death was stabbing. Now, he was characterized as basically an unidentified man who had a broken nose, or might have had a broken nose. He was of mixed descent. He possibly had dark hair. He suffered from degenerative disease in his back and in his neck, specifically his lower back and his neck, in his coccyx and sacral vertebra. They were fused, and that he was missing no teeth whatsoever. He had all of his teeth in his mouth. It was also released that he was wearing a dark blue short sleeve shirt that had a similar design to that of a shirt from Mustard Seed Faith Designer. And he was wearing green boxers, and he also had a sleeping bag that was white, blue, and tan plaid lining. This John Doe was then dubbed the Yolo County John Doe. No, I'm not kidding. That was his title until he was identified. Now, the Yolo County DA's office released that this John Doe was Gerron Gipson. It was made public on June this year with the help of Paraben Nanolabs. Paraben is also like Redgrave and also like Othram. They do a lot of genetics work with crime. Gerron Gipson went 29 years without his name and finally got it back. His case still remains unsolved this day. So that, my friends, is the next 5 of the unidentifieds that were finally identified in 2022. I hope you have a great day.